There is a clay tablet in the Middle East department of the British Museum in London, catalogue number BM78941, and it is about the size of a hand, not a large hand, a normal hand, the kind that presses wet clay flat against a smooth wooden surface before the writing begins, that smooths the face of it gently to receive the marks, that lifts a cut reed from the jar where it has been sitting and begins pressing the small wedge-shaped impressions that scholars call cuneiform, the word that comes from the Latin for wedge-shaped. The tablet is roughly rectangular, flat on the front and slightly curved on the back, the way fired clay sometimes curves when it hardens, and it is marked on both faces with this script, column after column of tiny wedge impressions pressed by someone sitting in a room in the ancient city of Sippar sometime around 1635 years before the Common Era. That is approximately 3,600 years ago. The marks are still there. The words they record are still legible to people who have spent many years learning to read them. Sippar is gone, or close enough to gone that it amounts to the same thing. Its ruins lie under the low brown mounds of a place now called Tel Abu Haba, in the Baghdad Governorate of modern Iraq, about 30 kilometers southwest of the city now called Baghdad, and 69 kilometers north of where the ancient city of Babylon once stood, on the east bank of the Euphrates River. The Euphrates is still there, dark and slow and carrying silt down from the mountains to the south, the same river that ran past Sippar 3,600 years ago, when the scribe pressed the marks into the wet face of the tablet that became BM78941. And the mounds of Tel Abu Haba are still there too, low shapes against the wide sky covering what the city left behind. The tablet has been sitting in London for a very long time, in a building in the Bloomsbury neighbourhood of the city, in a case or a storage room in the Middle East department, patient in the way that things made of fired clay are patient when nothing is required of them. The tablet carries part of a text that scholars call the Atrahasis Epic, named after its human hero, an Akkadian epic composed in the language of ancient Babylon, pressed into clay in the writing system the Sumerians had developed before the Babylonians adopted it, and estimated to have been composed in the period that scholars call the Old Babylonian period, roughly 2,000 to 1,600 years before the Common Era, which makes the text itself somewhat older than the Sippar tablet, which is a copy, one of many copies made over many centuries, because the story was considered important enough to keep copying. The text opens with a phrase in Akkadian, Inuma ilu awilum, which translates roughly as when the gods were like man, or when the gods were in the ways of men. If you find this restful, like and subscribe. There are more of these coming. It is one of the stranger opening lines of any ancient text I have spent time with, because it points immediately to a time before the current arrangement of the world, before the distance between divine and human was settled, when something between the two categories existed in a way the text is about to explain, slowly and carefully, over the course of more than 1,000 lines pressed into clay. A god was put into the clay. That is the essential claim of this text, the thing it is really about, the thing that I find myself returning to when I sit with it late at night. Not a symbol of a god, not a quality that a god granted from a distance, but the actual physical substance of a divine being, blood and flesh, and the specific quality that made that particular god what he was, mixed into the earth, and shaped into the first human form. The drumbeat is still inside you. Those two ideas belong together, and the tablet is what connects them, and the tablet has been sitting there for a very long time. The world the Atrahasis epic describes before human beings existed was a world of labour and exhaustion and eventually refusal. The great gods, called the Anunnaki, who held authority over the ordering of things, had set the lesser gods, the Igigi, to work on the land. The Igigi dug the rivers, maintained the canals, turned the earth, kept the irrigation channels flowing across the wide flat plain of Mesopotamia, so that grain could grow and the divine world could sustain itself. The plain of ancient Babylonia was immense and flat, and the sky above it was very large, and across this plain the network of canals ran in careful lines, carrying water from the Tigris and the Euphrates out into the dry fields, making the dry earth productive, making everything that followed possible. The Igigi maintained this network. They did it for a long time, a very long time, and the text says 40 years, which likely does not mean 40 literal years, but a period long enough that the exhaustion of it had become total, and nothing could be added to it. And then they stopped. They gathered in the night, the text says, and they burned their tools, their spades and baskets, their digging equipment, and they walked together to the gate of the house of Enlil, the great god of sky and wind and earth, and they refuse to continue. The text does not present this as a simple act of evil. It allows the lesser gods some dignity in their refusal, presents it as the understandable consequence of a labour that had become unbearable, and then describes the result, which was a crisis among the gods, a great assembly called to address the question of what to do with the work that still needed to be done and the workers who would no longer do it. The god Enki spoke. Enki, the god of fresh water and wisdom and craft, who lived in the underground ocean called the Abzu, the freshwater sea beneath the earth that fed the springs and rivers of the surface world, was always the one with the solution no one else had found, always the one who saw the path that others had missed. He proposed that a new kind of being be created, not a god, something made from the earth, from clay, from the dark river soil that the Igigi had spent so long working. Clay could hold a shape. Clay could be formed into something that stood and moved. But clay alone could not think, could not understand what was being asked of it, could not carry out the complex work of maintaining the irrigation canals and the fields that fed the world. The new being needed something more than earth, and what Enki proposed, what the assembly of gods then carried out, is the thing I keep returning to, the thing I find I cannot sit with too quickly. He proposed that they put a god into the clay. A god was put into the clay, not by a decree issued from above, not through a gift of qualities, but through the physical death of a specific divine being whose substance, blood, flesh, and something deeper than either, was mixed directly into the clay by the hands of the mother goddess. She is called Nintu in some passages, Belet Ili in others, Mami in others still, a being with several names who held authority over birth and the shaping of living forms. She mixed the clay and the divine blood and the divine flesh together. She shaped 14 figures from the mixture, 7 female and 7 male. And the first humans came into the world carrying something inside them that had not come from the earth. The god chosen for this was a minor god among the Igigi, one of the rebels, one who had burned his tools and walked to Enlil's gate and refused to continue. He is called Weelu in the text, also written Ilawela in some scholarly transcriptions, and called Geshtui in related Sumerian sources, and he is described in the Atrahasis with a detail that the text treats as essential, as the specific reason he was chosen above others. He had a quality that the Akkadian text names as Timu. The word means intelligence, or understanding, or the capacity to perceive what is being asked and respond to it in an organized way. Something like the ability to think, to reason, to know what a thing is and what to do about it. Weelu had Temu. The assembly of gods agreed that his Temu was what the clay needed if the resulting beings were going to be able to do the work that the Igigi had refused. They slaughtered him. The text is direct about this. They slaughtered Weelu in the assembly, and Nintu took his flesh and his blood and mixed them with the clay, and the mixture was shaped, and the drumbeat began. This is the moment the text is most careful about, and the scholars who have spent the most time with it have been most careful about it in turn. W. G. Lamber, who was born in 1926 and spent most of his career at the University of Birmingham, and was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 1971, produced with his colleague A. R. Millard the standard scholarly edition of the Atrahasis epic in 1969, published by the Clarendon Press at Oxford under the title Atrahasis, the Babylonian Story of the Flood. It remains the edition that other scholars work from when they need to establish what the text actually says at any given point. Lamber was one of the foremost readers of Akkadian religious texts of the 20th century, and his patient and careful work on the Atrahasis, working through multiple damaged and fragmentary copies to reconstruct the most defensible version of each passage, is the foundation on which most of the subsequent scholarship on this material rests. The tablet has been sitting in the British Museum for a very long time. Lambert spent much of that long time making sure the words on it are understood as accurately as they can be. The drumbeat forever after. I have read this passage many times, and I'm still not entirely sure I've absorbed everything it is saying. The drumbeat. In Akkadian, the word for drum is upu, and the word for heart is libu, and the two words rhyme, and the text is playing on that rhyme in a way that is deliberate and careful. The drumbeat that humans carry in their bodies, the steady sound of a heartbeat that has been present in every living person since the first one drew breath, is described in this passage as the continuing presence of Weelu inside the body. Not a memory of him, not a symbol of what he was, his actual continuing presence, the pulse of something divine that was killed and pressed into the clay and has been beating in human bodies ever since, quiet and steady, in the soft interior of the chest, in the place behind the ribs where the heart sits. The drumbeat is still inside you. That is what the tablet says. A ghost came into existence from the god's flesh. She proclaimed it as his living sign. The ghost, the Atemu in Akkadian, a word borrowed from the older Sumerian Giddim, is the divine quality that passes into the clay through We'ilu's blood and flesh, and becomes part of every human being at the moment of creation. It is not a soul in the later sense, not the Greek psyche that lives independently of the body and passes through it on its way to some separate eternal existence. The Mesopotamian Atemu was something different from that, something older and more physical, and the scholars who have written most carefully about it have been careful to separate it from the later traditions that tend to get mixed in when modern readers encounter the word ghost or spirit or soul. Tzvi Abush of Brandeis University, who has written carefully on Babylonian conceptions of human nature and what he describes as the relationship between ghost and god in ancient Mesopotamian thought, has noted that the Atemu was closely associated with the physical corpse, more closely than the concept of the psyche in classical Greek thought, which tended to imagine a clean separation between the eternal soul and the temporary body. The Atemu was not separate from the body. It was tied to the physical substance of the body, anchored in the flesh and the bone, needing the physical remains in the way that a flame needs a lamp. The flame is not the lamp. The flame is not the oil. But without the lamp and the oil, the flame cannot persist. And if the lamp is destroyed, the flame goes out. The ghost in the flesh has been there since the beginning. And the ghost needs the flesh to remain. When the Atemu left the body at death, it needed to travel somewhere. The ancient Mesopotamians had a name for that place, Irkala. Some texts call it Kur, which means mountain or underworld, the dark interior of the earth below the surface world where the living moved and worked and maintained the canals. Some texts call it simply the Great City, or the Land of No Return. The Descent of Inanna, one of the oldest literary texts in any language, describes the underworld as a place without light, where the dead eat dust and drink clay, where they wear feathers like birds and sit in the dark. It is not a place of punishment in any moral sense that we would recognize. The ancient Mesopotamians did not generally operate on the idea that the afterlife was a reward for good living or a penalty for bad. The Atemu arrived in the underworld and was assigned a place there by the court of the Anunnaki, not through any judgment of the life it had led, but through a process that scholars describe as more clerical than ethical, a matter of registration and placement in the order of the community of the dead. The social hierarchies of the living were reproduced roughly among the dead. A person of high status in Sippar would occupy a different position in Irkala than a labourer from the same city. But both were there, both carried the Atemu of We'ilu inside whatever remained of their physical substance, both needed the offerings of their descendants to continue in whatever continued meant in that dark and quiet place. The Atemu in some descriptions was said to look bird-like, to have a feathered or winged form in the underworld, which is an image that appears in several Mesopotamian texts that describe encounters between the living and the dead. It is a striking image, the divine intelligence of We'ilu, pressed into clay at the beginning of human history, travelling to the underworld in a form that suggests something between the earthly and the aerial, between the physical and the free. But the bird form of the Atemu in the underworld does not contradict the close attachment to the physical remains that the texts also describe. The Atemu needed the bones. It also travelled. These two things existed together in the Mesopotamian understanding without apparent contradiction, the way many things exist together in very old beliefs that have not been systematized into a single coherent philosophy by anyone who needed to make them fit neatly. The texts simply say what they say, and the scholars read what the tablets say, and the text is still not fully understood. This is the deep logic behind Mesopotamian burial practices, which were specific and careful and understood as carrying real moral weight. A body that was not properly buried left its Atemu without a place to settle, without the direction toward the underworld that burial provided. A body that was burned, completely consumed by fire, left its Atemu without any physical anchor at all, and this was considered one of the worst fates that could happen to a person in ancient Mesopotamian belief. Not because of any abstract theological principle, because of this very specific understanding of where the Atemu lived and what it needed in order to continue. The spirit lived in the body. The spirit needed the body, or what remained of it. The bones were the hardest, most lasting, most interior part of the physical substance, the part that outlasted everything else, the part that stayed in the ground long after the softer tissues were gone, and it was the bones that the burial was designed to protect and maintain. A god was put into the clay. The god's quality, the Temu of Wei-Lu, the intelligence that was mixed into the first human bodies, does not simply vanish when a person dies. It becomes the Atemu, the ghost, still present in the physical remains, still needing the physical remains, still attached to the bones in the ground in the dark. This is also why the living had ongoing obligations to the dead in Mesopotamian culture. Regular obligations, practical and specific. Small portions of food and water were left at the grave or poured into the earth through narrow clay pipes that allowed liquid to reach the interred body below the surface. The Atemu needed sustenance, and the living descendants of the dead were responsible for providing it. Without those regular offerings, the Atemu would suffer, and a suffering Atemu might leave the underworld and return to the world above, not from malice exactly, but from need, from the desperation of a thing that carries the divine quality of Wei-Lu inside it and cannot find what it requires to rest. The return of an improperly tended ghost was considered a source of illness and misfortune for the living. The bond between the living and the dead ran through the bones that the dead had left behind, through the physical substance that still carried the pulse of a god placed there at the moment of creation, still faintly present in the dark of the earth, waiting for the small offering of water and grain that the text says it needed. The ghost in the flesh has been there since the beginning. The ghost in the bone is patient, but it does not forget. The wordplay that runs through the creation passage of the Atrahasis is one of the things that makes this text unusual, even among the remarkable body of ancient Mesopotamian literature, and I want to describe it carefully, though I should be honest that it does not survive fully into English, and I am not certain I can convey what it actually does in Akkadian. In Akkadian, the word for human being is Awilu. The word for God is Ilu. The name of the god who was sacrificed is Wei-Ilu. That name contains Ilu within it. The divine quality is built into the name of the being whose death was used to create humanity, so that a reader in Akkadian hears the connection between the divine and the human as a matter of sound before they even reach the narrative. The creation of a Wei-Lu from the body of Wei-Lu through the mixing of God and clay is a linguistic act as much as a narrative one, and I find I return to this detail specifically because it suggests that whoever wrote this text was thinking very carefully about the relationship between language and reality, about the way a name can carry its own meaning inside it, the way a body carries the Etemu inside it. And then there is the word Temu, the intelligence, the understanding, the specific quality that Wei-Ilu had and that the gods chose him for. From Temu comes a Temu, the ghost, the divine spirit that has been in human flesh since the beginning. The ghost in the flesh carries the word for understanding inside its own name. The Atemu that every human carries is not simply a spirit or a shade. It is, at the level of the language the text was written in, the divine intelligence of the god who was killed to make it. The Temu of Wei-Lu, still present in the body, still giving the body the capacity to perceive and think and understand what is being asked of it, still beating in the rhythm that the text calls the drum beat. I should be honest that the question of what exactly the ancient Mesopotamians meant by a god's intelligence, what Temu actually describes at its fullest range of meaning, is not one that scholars have completely settled, and I do not want to say more than the evidence supports. What I can say is that the text treats it as something real and specific, and physically transferable, something carried in the blood and the flesh, something that could pass from a god into the clay through the act of mixing. The text is still not fully understood, but the basic movement of it is clear. A god was put into the clay, and the god is still there, and his name is inside the name of the ghost, and the ghost is in the bone. The city of Sippar, where BM 78941 was pressed and fired and stored, was a city of the sun. Everything about Sippar, its identity, its major institutions, its position in the network of Mesopotamian cities, pointed toward the god Shamash, called Utu in the older Sumerian language, the god who travelled across the sky by day and through the underworld by night, and who held authority over justice and clear sight and the ability to distinguish one true thing from another. The great temple of Sippar was the Ababa, which means shining house in Sumerian, and the Ababa was one of the most important religious sites in Mesopotamia across many centuries of the city's long history. It was maintained, rebuilt, repaired, expanded. Kings from many different eras of Mesopotamian history recorded their contributions to the Ababa. The temple was old and then very old and still standing. It is something I find myself turning over when I think about this text. The fact that the story of what is inside a human body was preserved in the library of a temple dedicated to the god of clear sight. Shamash was the one who could look down from the sky and see everything without obstruction, who witnessed oaths and held the record of what was true, who presided over the legal system of Mesopotamia because he could not be deceived and could not fail to see. The scribes who worked in the rooms of the Ababa temple library worked under the authority of that quality, the clarity of vision that looks through surfaces to what is actually there. And in that library they preserved the text that describes what is actually inside a human being. The divine quality of Wielu, the Temu, the Atemu, the drumbeat, the ghost in the flesh. The tablet has been sitting in London for a very long time, and it came from a library dedicated to seeing clearly. Sippar was occupied for a very long time. Across the early dynastic period and the Old Babylonian period and the Kassite and Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian periods, a span covering several thousand years of continuous habitation, in the same place on the same river, the sun rose and set over Sippar, and the temple of Shamash stood at the city's centre, and the scribes worked in the rooms around it, and the clay records accumulated, tablet after tablet, text after text, generation after generation, until there were tens of thousands of them, and the city slowly became quiet, and the sand covered it the way the wind covers things when there is enough time and enough sand and nothing is in a hurry. The man who brought the tablets from Sippar to London was born in Mosul in 1826 and died in Hove in the south of England in 1910. His name was Hormuzd Rassam, and he was the son of a Christian family in a Muslim city in what was then the Ottoman Empire, and he grew up to become one of the most productive field archaeologists of the 19th century, spending many years excavating for the British Museum across multiple sites in Iraq. He had studied at Oxford, Magdalen College, for 18 months in the early 1850s, after travelling to England with the British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard, and he returned to the field and spent years working across the mounds of the Mesopotamian plain, at Nineveh and Nimrud and elsewhere, lifting ancient objects from the ground and sending them to London in crates, the method of the era, efficient in some ways and deeply imperfect in its record-keeping, since the relationship between an object and the specific place it was found is information that cannot be recovered once the object has been moved. In 1880, Rassam began excavating the mound of Tel Abu Haba, covering ancient Sippar, and over the following 18 months he and his workers uncovered somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 clay tablets from the temple precincts. 40,000 tablets in 18 months from a single mound. The number is difficult to picture, and the process of reading and cataloguing and publishing those tablets has been ongoing ever since the crates arrived at the British Museum in the early 1880s. There are tablets from that excavation that have not yet been fully published. The text is still not fully understood, even now, 145 years after Rassam's workers lifted the tablets from the earth of the Baghdad governorate into the dry heat of the Mesopotamian afternoon. Rassam himself could not read cuneiform. He could recognize a tablet as a tablet, could direct the careful lifting of it from the soil, could ensure it reached London without being broken more than it already was. The reading came later, by scholars in London and Oxford and Berlin and Chicago, who had spent their careers learning a script that had been a dead written language for 2,000 years before 19th century scholars began to recover it. The tablets from Sippar arrived in a building in London, and the slow work of understanding them began, and is still going on. Among those tablets was BM 78941 and its companion BM 78943, both carrying portions of the Atrahasis epic, both dated to approximately 1635 BCE, both preserving the story of Wielu and the drumbeat and the ghost that came into existence from the god's flesh. A student scribe in Sippar may have made one of these tablets as a training exercise, pressing the marks into wet clay under the supervision of a more senior teacher, reading the words about the drumbeat perhaps for the first time, not yet fully understanding what they said, the way one often does not fully understand something the first time it's encountered, or the 5th time, or the 20th. I find myself in that position with this text on a regular basis. The tablet has been sitting in the British Museum for a very long time, and the marks it carries are still more than I've fully read. The physical object of a cuneiform tablet is worth trying to picture clearly, because it is easy to think of ancient texts as fragile or rarefied things, and these tablets are neither. A clay tablet is heavy for its size. It has weight in the hand that paper does not have, a density that comes from the fired earth it is made of, and the marks on its surface are not painted or scratched but impressed into the clay while it was wet, so that the information is literally inside the surface of the object rather than applied to it from outside. When you hold a cuneiform tablet, or look at photographs of one in a museum catalogue, which is the more common experience, what you see is a surface textured with small triangular impressions arranged in columns, row after row, the marks very close together, the whole thing dense with recorded language in a way that conveys even to someone who cannot read it, that a great deal of care went into putting these marks in this order, in this particular piece of clay. BM 78941 is not a large tablet. It is a working copy, the kind made for preservation in a library rather than for display, and its marks were pressed by someone who had pressed many similar marks on many similar tablets before it, and would press many more after. The tablet has been sitting in London for a very long time, handling all of that time in the way fired clay handles time, which is to say without any particular difficulty. Sippar was not the only city where the Atrahasis epic was preserved. The ancient city of Nippur, which sat roughly between Sippar to the north and Uruk to the south on the plain of Babylonia, was another centre of scribal education and temple library preservation, and copies of the Atrahasis were found at Nippur as well as at Sippar and at other sites across Mesopotamia. Nippur was the city of the god Enlil, the great god of sky and wind whose authority over the land was challenged by the Igigis rebellion in the opening of the Atrahasis epic, and the presence of the text in Enlil's city alongside its presence in Shamash's city at Sippar gives some sense of how widely the story circulated and how broadly it was regarded as part of the shared literary inheritance of Mesopotamian civilization. The text moved between cities the way knowledge moves when it is considered important enough to carry. A god was put into the clay. The scribes of Nippur and Sippar and Nineveh all kept the record of it. The Atrahasis epic was not the only ancient Mesopotamian text to describe the creation of human beings from divine blood. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, sometimes called the Seven Tablets of Creation, inscribed on 7 tablets of which 6 survive more or less completely, and the 7th is known only in fragments, describes a similar event in different terms. The Enuma Elish is the epic of the god Marduk, the great god of Babylon, who defeats the chaos goddess Tiamat in the war at the beginning of things and uses her body to build the sky and the earth. After the war, the blood of the defeated general king, who had led Tiamat's armies, is taken and mixed with earth to create humanity. The purpose is the same as in the Atrahasis. The gods want servants to take over the work that would otherwise fall to them. The method is the same, divine blood in clay. But the Enuma Elish does not stay with the question of what the divine blood actually does inside the body, does not follow it down into the long consideration of the Atemu and the drumbeat, and the obligations that the living carry toward the dead because of what is stored in the bones. That is what the Atrahasis provides that the Enuma Elish does not, and it is why scholars return to BM 78941 and BM 78943 specifically when they want to understand the Mesopotamian conception of what a human being actually is, at the deepest level, inside. The Enuma Elish was the text that was recited in Babylon every year at the Great New Year Festival, the Akitu, when the entire population of the city would gather to hear the creation stories sung or chanted by priests in the Temple of Marduk. The Atrahasis was different, not a public recitation text in the same way, but a text that was preserved in temple libraries and copied by scribes and read by the people who maintained the written tradition of Mesopotamian religious and literary knowledge. That the Atrahasis continued to be copied for nearly 1,000 years, from the 17th century BCE down to the 7th century BCE, when Assyrian scribes working in the library of King Ashurbanipal at Nineveh made their own copies, tells you something about how it was regarded by the people who knew it. A god was put into the clay. The drumbeat is still inside you. These were not ideas that Mesopotamian civilization grew out of or left behind. They were ideas it kept returning to, kept pressing into clay, kept storing in the libraries of the cities of the plain beside the two rivers. The Atrahasis epic is named after its human hero for a reason. The second half of the text, after the creation of humanity and after Weirlu's divine quality, has been placed in the clay and the drumbeat has begun, describes what happens when the god Enlil decides to reduce or destroy the humans he helped create. They multiply too quickly, the text says, and they are too loud, and their noise disturbs Enlil's rest. This is one of the strange qualities of the epic, that it describes the problem of human existence from the perspective of the gods as a problem of sound, of unceasing noise rising from the plain, the sound of the beings the gods themselves made, who now cannot be made quiet. Enlil sends plague, then drought, then famine, each time intending to reduce the human population to a manageable level, and each time the god Enki, who proposed the creation of humans in the first place, and who maintains a particular sympathy for these clay and god creatures throughout the epic, finds a way to warn the human hero Atrahasis, whose name means extremely wise, and tells him how to survive the disaster. Finally, Enlil sends the flood, total and catastrophic, and Atrahasis builds a boat on Enki's instructions and loads it with his family and the animals of the world, and rides out the destruction. And then the text does something I find quietly remarkable. When the flood ends and the waters recede and Atrahasis makes an offering from his boat, the gods gather around it, and the text describes them as hungry. Without the humans who had been made to maintain the world, there are no offerings at the temples, no grain and oil and beer left at the altars, and the divine beings are uncomfortable in a way the text describes directly and without apology. The gods were hungry. Enlil, who ordered the destruction, has to accept in the end what Enki had always understood, that the arrangement made when a god was put into the clay is permanent, that the divine world and the human world are bound together by what was placed inside the first body at the beginning, and that even the god who most wanted the noisy clay beings gone cannot do without them once they are absent. The ghost in the flesh has been there since the beginning, and even Enlil, in the end, finds he cannot do without it. The text closes not with the elimination of humanity, but with its continuation, and with a set of provisions built into the human condition: death, childlessness in some, the limits of a mortal life, so that the noise does not become unbearable again. The beings with the Atemu inside them are necessary. That is the final position. Galamba spent much of his long career returning to this material. Beyond the 1969 edition of the Atrahasis with Millard, he wrote extensively on Babylonian creation theology and the nature of the divine-human relationship in ancient Mesopotamian thought, contributing to the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary Project, one of the great collective scholarly works of the 20th century, taking close to 100 years to complete and producing an authoritative dictionary of the Akkadian language built from thousands of tablet texts held in institutions across the world, and publishing studies of individual passages and related texts throughout the decades that followed his foundational edition. He died in 2011. The text is still not fully understood, and scholars who work with it today acknowledge Lambert's contribution as foundational and continue to build on it. There is a quality to the history of this scholarship that I find quietly remarkable, which is how recently almost all of it became available. The Atrahasis epic, this text that describes the most fundamental thing about what a human being is according to the oldest literate civilization we know of, the divine quality inside the clay, the drum beat, the ghost that has been in the flesh since the beginning, was entirely unknown to modern scholarship until the 19th century and was not fully translated into readable English until the 20th century, and is still being refined in its details today. The civilization that produced it continued in recognizable form for something like 4,000 years, across many empires and many languages and many changes to the political landscape of the ancient world. And across all of that time, this text was read and copied and considered important enough to maintain. Then it was buried under the mounds of Sippar and Nineveh, and it was gone, completely unknown for 2,000 years or more, before Rassam's workers lifted it from the earth and sent it to London in a crate. The ghost in the flesh has been there since the beginning. The tablet has also been there, first in the temple library, then in the ground, then in London, waiting in the way that things wait when they have nowhere else to be. The question of what exactly the ancient Mesopotamians meant when they described the Atemu as being in the flesh and in the body, how precisely they located the divine quality within the physical substance, is one that the texts do not answer as directly as I sometimes wish they would. and I want to be careful here not to say more than the evidence supports. The texts do not specify bone marrow as a location the way some later traditions would describe the innermost physical substance as the seat of the divine. What they say is that the Atemu is in the flesh, came from the god's flesh, lives in the human flesh, is the living sign of the god inside the body, and that it is so closely bound to the physical remains that its continued existence depends on those remains being present and maintained. The implication of the bones is in the logic of the thing rather than the specific vocabulary of it. The bones are the most durable part of the body, the part that outlasts everything else, the part that is still there in the earth long after the softer tissues have gone. When the texts describe the Atemu as needing the physical remains, when they describe the horror of cremation as the destruction of the ghost's home, what they are pointing toward is the deepest and most lasting substance of the body, and that is the bone. The heart was important too. In the Akkadian body concept, the heart, Libu, was the seat of feeling and thought, the place where emotions formed and decisions originated, the place whose steady drumbeat the text identifies as the continuing sound of Wi-Ilu inside the body. In Akkadian medical and religious texts, the heart is where consciousness lives, where the person's intentions form, where the Atemu is perhaps most actively present as something that thinks and perceives and responds to the world. But the Atemu does not live only in the heart. It is distributed through the physical substance of the person, carried in all of it, and when the person dies it does not depart from the heart and go elsewhere. It stays in whatever remains. It needs whatever remains. It is in the bones in the ground, still carrying the quality that was placed there when Wi-Ilu's blood was mixed with the river clay, still faintly present in the quiet of the earth, requiring the small maintenance of the living to remain at rest. I do not know why this detail stays with me as much as it does. There is something in the specificity of it, the idea that the divine quality inside the body is not an abstraction, but something with a physical location, something that needs a physical home, something that depends on the actual substance of the body, and does not simply float free of it, that I keep returning to when I sit with this text late at night. It is not the kind of claim that fits easily into the religious categories that came after it. It is something older and stranger and more physical than any of those later frameworks, and the tablet that carries it is still in London, and the marks are still there, and the text is still not fully understood. The plain of Babylonia where Sippar stood was a flat open landscape, the sky very large above it, the light harsh in summer and cool in winter, the horizon a long straight line in every direction, where the land met the sky with nothing between them. The plain was farmland, organised carefully around the network of canals that the Igigi had dug in the mythological time before human beings existed, and that human hands had maintained ever since, carrying water from the rivers through the flat land to the fields where barley grew, the kind of grain that could tolerate the salt that built up in the soil over time as the irrigation water evaporated, the smell of barley in the morning, and the smell of the river on a still day, and the smell of wet clay in a scribe's workroom when the tablets were being made. These were the ordinary sensory facts of life in a city like Sippar, the background of everything written and read and stored in the rooms of the Ababa temple. The scribes who copied the Atrahasis epic were people with jobs, people who went home at the end of a working day and ate their meals and slept through the long nights of the Babylonian plain. They were not mystics sitting alone with sacred texts in isolation. They were trained professionals who worked in an institution and copied the text that the institution required them to copy, and among those texts was this one, the story of the time before humans existed, and the decision the gods made and the god they killed, and the divine quality they pressed into the clay to make the first human beings capable of the work that was required of them. A student learning to write in the cuneiform tradition would copy established texts as part of their training, and some of the surviving copies of the Atrahasis are thought to be student exercises, practice tablets made by young scribes learning the craft under the supervision of a more experienced teacher. I find myself thinking about that particular student sometimes, pressing the words about the drum beat into wet clay with a cut reed, the teacher sitting nearby reading the marks, the workroom quiet and smelling of clay and the river outside, the wide flat sky of Babylonia above the rooftops of Sippar, the sun travelling across it in the way Shamash always travelled, steady and certain and seeing everything clearly. A god was put into the clay. The student pressed the words and the teacher read them, and outside the temple of the shining house the sun moved west. The tablet BM78941 is about the size of a hand. It sits in the Middle East department of the British Museum in London, where it has been since the early 1880s when Hormuzd Rassem's crates arrived from Tel Abba, in a building in Bloomsbury in the city of London, very far from the bank of the Euphrates where it was made. The marks on its surface are the marks pressed by someone in Sippar approximately 3,600 years ago, and those marks still carry the story of Weealoo and the drumbeat, and the ghost that came into existence from the god's flesh, and was proclaimed as his living sign. The tablet has been sitting there for a very long time. It was sitting in Sippar for a long time before Rassam found it. It was sitting in the dark of the earth for a long time before the mound of Tel Abu Habba was excavated. Everything about the Atrahasis epic and the civilization that produced it involves a long time. The slow accumulation of tablets in a temple library, the slow burial of a city under the sand, the slow recovery of the tablets and the slow work of reading them, the slow understanding of what they say building across generations of scholars who read what the previous generation wrote and added to it and corrected it and passed it on. The drumbeat is still inside you. That is what the tablet says, in the language of its wordplay and its imagery, in the connection it draws between the god who was killed and the heartbeat that followed, and the ghost that has lived in human flesh ever since the first clay figure rose from the hands of the mother goddess and drew the first breath on the wide, flat plain beside the two rivers. The ghost came into existence from the god's flesh. She proclaimed it as his living sign, and the sign has been beating, quiet and steady, in every body that has ever lived, in the soft interior of the chest, in the deep place inside the bone where the most durable part of the body keeps what was placed there at the beginning. A god was put into the clay. The ghost in the flesh has been there since the beginning. The tablet is still in London, in a building very far from the Euphrates, in the Department of the Middle East, in the care of scholars who are still working through what it says and what it connects to, and what remains in it that has not yet been fully read. The text is still not fully understood. There is time. The tablets are patient. And the thing the tablet describes, the divine quality mixed into the first human body, the drumbeat of the slain god inside every living person, the Atemuin, the bone waiting in the dark of the earth for the small maintenance of the living. All of that is still there also, exactly where it was put, a very long time ago on the wide flat plain beside the slow river, before the sand covered the city and the tablets went dark and the stars moved overhead in their courses steady and unhurried, the way things move when they have been moving for longer than anyone has been counting, and the night is long, and there is no particular reason to understand everything at once, and the drumbeat continues in the place it has always been, quiet and deep and very old, keeping its own time in the dark.